What's going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about when and how to focus stack. Now, if you're new to landscape photography, you might be wondering what the hell is focus stacking anyways. Well, basically it's a technique we use to overcome the depth of field limitations of our cameras. For example, if you go out shooting a waterfall and in your scene you've got some rocks that are a few feet away from you that you want to include as a foreground element, and you've got your waterfall, that's your main subject, way in the background. Even if you close down your aperture all the way down to f22 to get the greatest depth of field possible, you still won't get everything in your scene tack sharp. Something will be out of focus, either your waterfall or your foreground element. Now, to overcome this, what we as landscape photographers like to do is take multiple pictures focusing at various points throughout the scenes, and then later in post-production, we merge these images together and we get one image that's tack sharp from the very front to the back. Now, if we look at the screen here, I'll show you what I mean. So looking at the image here, you'll see that, looking in the background, all of the tiny little leaves and branches in the background, as well as the rocks down here, are all sharp. And if we move closer to the foreground, you'll notice that these rocks are also sharp. So if we look at the original images, you'll see we have this one here, where I focused on the background to get the background sharp. And if we look at the front, the rocks in the foreground are extremely blurry. Now if we look at the second picture I took, if we look at the rocks in the foreground, they are sharp. But if we move to the background here, our branches and our leaves, as well as the rocks down here, they're not as sharp as our other image. Before we jump into the process of blending these images together, let me give you a bit of the thought process that went into capturing that scene. Now, I was able to get everything in focus with just 2 shots, but depending on the scene that you're going to be photographing, you might require a third shot if your foreground element is very close to the lens, to make sure you have both your foreground, your midground, and background in focus. Now, in this particular scene, I didn't have much of a foreground. The rocks that you do see in the foreground, they were more a midground. They were a good third of the way into the scene, so I didn't require a third shot. Now you'll notice between the 2 pictures, the first one had a 1/5 of a second shutter speed, and you can tell by the motion blur in the water that it was a much faster exposure. And the reason for that is I wanted to make sure that the trees were sharp, because that was the image I was focusing on, the trees in the waterfall. So because of the wind, I wanted to avoid any movement in the trees, which is why I ended up with the 1/5 of a second shutter speed. Now with the second picture, I didn't care if there was any movement in the trees. That portion of the picture would not be included in the final image. So I allowed myself to go all the way to 2-second exposure, which gave me that silky smooth water, which I was going for. And since the rocks in the foreground are not going to move from the wind, it didn't matter if it was a 2-second exposure. One final thing before we jump back into Lightroom and Photoshop, I just want to point out I'll be covering 2 different ways of blending the images together. The first one is quick, it's easy, but it doesn't allow you as much control over the final image. But if you are not too comfortable with Photoshop, it's a great way to get started. Now with the second one, it's a bit more complicated, but it allows you a lot more control over the final result. All right, enough of my face. Let's get back to Lightroom and blend those images. All right, as you can see here, I've already done some basic adjustments to both pictures. I corrected the white balance. I was going for more of a cooler tones, moody look since there was some fog that morning. I also matched the exposure between the 2 images. Lifted the contrast a little bit, lifted the shadows, and added some dehaze because there was a bit too much fog for the look I was going for. Also added some contrast back with the curves here, and then at the bottom here I removed the chromatic aberrations and enabled profile correction. So once you've done your basic adjustments in Lightroom, you're going to want to select both pictures here, and you're going to right click on it, go to Edit in, Open as layers in Photoshop. Now I'm not going to click here because I've already went ahead and did that. Now we're going to switch over to Photoshop. Alright, so now that our pictures are open in Photoshop, you'll notice down here at the bottom right that we have both pictures open as separate layers. First thing we want to do, let's rename those layers so we know which one is which. So the top one, we're going to rename this to background. And this one is the foreground. All right, I'm actually going to put the background layer underneath the foreground this way. All right, so before we start blending these two pictures together, we want to make sure that they're both lined up properly. So if we turn off the top layer here, you're going to notice that there's a slight shift caused by the focus breathing. So you're going to want to select both layers down here in your layers panel. Go up to Edit, Auto Align Layers. I'll leave it at Auto and click OK. Now once Photoshop is done doing its thing, if we turn off the top layer, that shift is gone now. So we know that both our pictures are lined up, so that when we blend them together, the blend is going to be seamless. So now that our layers are aligned properly, we're going to go through the quick and easy way of blending these images together. And to do that, again, make sure that both your layers are selected down here at the bottom right. You're going to go to up to Edit and Auto Blend Layers. Now we're not doing a panorama, so you're going to select Stack Images, check the first box for seamless tones and colors, leave the other one unchecked, and click OK. Alright, so what Photoshop did here is it compared both layers to identify which part of each layer was in focus and which part was blurry, and then it applied a layer mask to each layer to hide the blurry portion and reveal the portions that are in focus. So if you're new to layer mask, basically, as the name suggests, it's a mask you apply to your layer to either hide or reveal portions of the layer. Basically, when you paint black onto the layer mask, it's going to hide that portion of that layer, and if you paint white, it's going to reveal this portion of the layer. Now if we go back to the screen here, I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. Now I've got this other image here from my last trip to Russia, which we're going to use to explain what a layer mask is. Now if we notice here at the bottom right, I've got two layers. I've got my background, which is my image, and I also added a very red layer on top. Now let's say I wanted to apply a layer mask. I'm just going to go down here and click on Add New Layer Mask. Now, as you can see, the mask is all white, meaning it's revealing 100% of that layer. If we take the brush tool and start painting with black, let's make this brush bigger here and bring up the opacity. You see, as I start painting black on the layer mask, it's hiding that part of the layer. So if we have a look at the layer mask, you can see that we painted some black on this section here. So if we go back to the layer, we're basically hiding this section of the layer, revealing the layer that's underneath. So that's basically what a layer mask is. All right, so if we go back to our other image, we can have a look at our layer masks here. If we turn on this layer mask, you can see that the vast majority of the foreground layer has been completely hidden, and those little white sections here are the sections that are revealed. Obviously, it didn't do that good of a good job, as you can see here, because anything that was above this point here, we did not want to reveal, but Photoshop went ahead and revealed some little sections here and there. As I said, I'm not quite happy with the way that this came out. I would have preferred having the water from the foreground, so we can fix that. All right, so we're going to select our foreground layer mask here, and with the black, so let's switch to black here, we're going to start painting over the top portion of the layer. Now it's doing some funky stuff here because the layer mask to the background here is actually hiding these sections here. So we're going to go to the background and switch to white, because now we want to reveal this portion of the background, and we're going to paint with white over the layer mask of our background layer to bring all this back in. All right, so now we've got the top portion of the image fixed. Now we need to bring in the water from the foreground. So we're going to go back to the foreground layer and make sure to select the layer mask, because if you select the actual layer and start painting, see what happens here? This is not what we want. We're actually painting with black on the layer. So let's undo this. Select the layer mask for the foreground. We've got white selected. I'm just going to start painting over this portion of the layer. Now we brought in the water from our foreground. So if we go and have a look at our layer mask for our foreground here, you can see that we're completely hiding the top portion of the foreground layer, which is going to reveal the layer that's underneath, being the background here. So this way, we have our sharp rocks in the foreground with our buttery smooth water, and then we have the sharp background. All right, so now let's go over the process of blending these images the manual way, which is a bit longer, but it's the same concept. We're going to be using layer masks, but instead of Photoshop deciding which portion to reveal and which portion to hide, we're going to 100% control it. So let's go back here to our layer masks, and we're going to delete the layer mask for both layers. All right, so let's create a layer mask for a foreground layer here. Now we don't really need a layer mask for the background because since the layer sits underneath, whatever portion of the foreground layer we reveal is going to overlap the background layer. So we're going to go down here and create a new layer mask by clicking on this icon. As you can see, our layer mask is white, meaning it's revealing 100% of our foreground layer. Now with your layer mask selected, click Ctrl-I on your keyboard to invert the layer mask. As you can see, it's completely black, so the foreground layer is completely hidden. If we were to turn it on and off here, you'll see nothing happens. So with our foreground layer visible, our layer mask selected, we're going to select the brush tool and switch over to the white color. Let's make our brush a little bigger here and bring the opacity down a tiny little bit, let's say 75%, and then start painting over the bottom portion of the image. Now I'm just doing this quickly because obviously if this was a portfolio shot, I'd be spending a lot more time zooming in the image, making sure that I go in between and around these rocks so that I don't bring in the blurry rocks from the foreground. So let's go ahead and do some of that here. Just bring in the water from our foreground layer. All right, so now we're pretty much done with the blend. Now we can save this image and bring it back into Lightroom. So if you just go to File and Save, and once Photoshop is done saving your image, you want to go back to Lightroom, and you're going to notice that our newly blended image has already been imported into Lightroom. So if we zoom in on the foreground here, everything is sharp. We've got the silky smooth water. And if we move up to the background, again, everything is tack sharp. So now the only last thing I want to do is, if you notice, there's a slight white border all around our image here. And that is a result of using the auto align tool in Photoshop. It had to resize one of the layers slightly in order to make them line up properly. So we're going to crop this border out. And I'm also going to crop the bottom portion of the image here. So let's go to the crop tool. And I'm going to select the Instagram crop, which is the 4x5. And I'm going to move it all the way up. And I'm going to grab it here on the left, bring it in slightly. Same thing on the right. And that's it. We get out of the crop. Our image is done. All right, guys, this pretty much covers it. I hope you found this video useful. And if you did, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It's a great way to support the channel. I also want to give a quick shout out to Alan McLennan, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, bro. We'll just blame it on the fact that I'm French. I'll put his Instagram down here at the bottom of the screen or in the description. Go check out his account, guys. This video came about following one of his comments from my previous videos asking I put together a focus stacking tutorial. So same goes for everybody else. If there's any subject you'd like me to cover in my videos, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll make sure to go over those in my future videos. Till next time, guys, stay safe. Peace.